want to understand future eating, you've got to come here to New Zealand. Because here, a whole cycle of future eating has taken place in just 800 years.
Isolated from the rest of the world, a unique fauna developed in New Zealand, one extremely vulnerable to the future eaters.
The arrival of the first rats here was to set off an ecological holocaust.
Tim Flannery's The Future Eaters, 6 o'clock next Sunday.
Between 3,500 and 1,000 years ago, the Pacific Ocean was crisscrossed by a sea people, nomadic wanderers who colonised the islands of Polynesia and beyond. These Hawaiian sailors are their descendants, and their twin-hulled canoe or waka is an accurate reconstruction of the vessels used by the first Polynesians for their extraordinary voyages of migration.
Okay, the sheet lines are clear, all the traces are back there.
To mark the achievements of their ancestors, these sailors have retraced the route to the Southern Ocean, to the most distant and difficult land to reach, on the fringes of Australasia. The Polynesians called this land Aotearoa, but we know it today as New Zealand. And the descendants of those first colonisers, out here in force to welcome the waka from their ancestral homeland, are now called the Maori. After the Aboriginal people, some 40,000 years before, this was the next wave of humans to arrive in Australasia. Like the Aborigines in Australia, they too were to have a profound impact on nature. In Australia, it's hard to know what it was like in the beginning, when humans first arrived. The details are just lost in the mists of time. And of course, we don't really know how future eating will end, because us Europeans have arrived so recently that we're yet to see what our full impact might be. So if you really want to understand future eating, you've got to come here to New Zealand. Because here, a whole cycle of future eating has taken place in just 800 years. Here, the story really has come full circle.
Ruia, ruia, tahia, tahia, kia he moa ke ki te kā, kua, 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 kia here mai ki te kau koroki. He tātaki mai nei ki tana pū, koro, koro, paikaro. He kua ka marangaranga, ko tahi tau i te tahuna, tau atu, tau atu, tau atu rā.
No one knows exactly why the Polynesian ancestors of the Maori set out on their great voyages of colonisation in huge ocean-going canoes. The largest of these sophisticated sailing craft could carry up to 250 people, as well as the plants and animals that they'd need to start a new life. They were nomads of the wind, who settled on remote tropical islands and lived there until food resources were exhausted. Then they packed up their waka and moved on, navigating by the stars. They first moved into the Pacific from Southeast Asia. For 2,000 years, they spread east and north, before finally heading south from eastern Polynesia to the land that was later to be known as New Zealand. When it finally came, landfall in Aotearoa must have been exhilarating. With a landmass of over 250,000 square kilometres, this new land was bigger than all the rest of Polynesia put together. Consisting of 2 mountainous islands, this was one of the last great wildernesses. And unlike Australia, this was a cool, moist and fertile land, quite different from the tiny tropical islands the voyagers had encountered before. These people had discovered wasn't just another island, it was a whole new micro-continent. And it was different from their homelands because this place wasn't tropical. It was so far south that its highest mountains were covered in snow. It was a cool and ancient land that really wasn't suited to their tropical agriculture and lifestyle. But I think what would have struck them most of all was that this place would have seemed to just stretch on forever and ever, and it would have been teeming with wildlife. When word got back to Polynesia of the bounty that could be found in the seas, coasts and forests of Aotearoa, it's highly probable that a mass-planned colonisation followed. Compared to the tiny tropical islands of the Pacific, this land was massive and teeming with game. The travellers from across the ocean had never seen wildlife of this kind before, or on this scale. And so they began to set down roots in this land of plenty, this gift from their gods. Away from the coasts, they found a world of mystery, ancient primeval forests, unlike anything they'd encountered before, full of extraordinary creatures. For these misty canopies and the species within them had evolved in isolation from the rest of the world ever since the breakup of the former continent of Gondwana 80 million years ago. This was a strange and unique land like no other on Earth. Even today, some of the animals are living testament to the island's ancient past. The tuatara is a primitive reptile of a kind thought to be 200 million years old, dating back to New Zealand's Gondwana origins, a relic from the time before the dinosaurs. The young are hatched from soft-shelled eggs after an incubation of up to a year, the longest of any reptile. Often called a living fossil, the tuatara has no close relations in the reptile world and has some unusual anatomical details, including the remnants of a third eye hidden under the skin. It takes the place in the ecosystem of mammal predators, of which there are none on these islands. If the tuatara is the reptilian equivalent of a mammal predator, then the giant weta is New Zealand's equivalent of a rodent. Around the same size as a mouse and somewhat similar in behaviour, it's the world's heaviest insect and another ancient Gondwana throwback. One of the rarest species is the rhinoceros weta. Like the animals after which they're named, they use their horns to good effect to resolve disputes over partners or territory. There are also around 30 species of giant carnivorous snail. Voracious hunters, they prey on giant earthworms, as well as on slugs and smaller snails. But more than anything else, Aotearoa, when the Polynesians arrived, was a bird paradise. Everywhere you went, the forest canopies were alive with birdsong, like a giant prehistoric aviary. For an Australian biologist, this place is like a mirror world. I can recognise most of the trees and plants, but the animals are completely different. Some of them, like the tuatara, died out in Australia 100 million years ago, but because of New Zealand's isolation, they still survive here. But what makes this place really special is that this is a land of birds, and many of them are flightless. Flightlessness is a typical island adaptation that the Polynesians would have encountered right through their epic voyages across the Pacific. Up on the cool, higher slopes of the mountains, the takahe feeds on tussock grass. Its large size is a positive advantage, as plant material here is difficult to digest and has relatively low food value. So the larger the herbivore, the more efficient it can be. And there's no need for speed and agility when there are no enemies on the ground to chase you. The camouflaging green-brown patch on its back, though, is a clue as to where danger lurks. The only endemic predators on the islands come from the sky. Spectacular birds of prey, like the New Zealand falcon. Along with the Australasian harrier, this is one of the last raptors left on New Zealand. But at the time of the arrival of the Polynesians, there were several others, including a gigantic eagle, which could easily have killed a man. Despite its camouflage, the takahe and other flightless foragers would have been easy prey for a lethal aerobatic hunter with the sharpest eyes in the business. As well as camouflaging yourself, the other way to avoid daytime aerial predators is to become nocturnal, like the national bird, the kiwi. Its exceptionally long beak has been developed to probe for insects in the soft forest leaf fall and to fish in the forest streams. It's the only bird in the world to have external nostrils at the end of its beak, and one of the few to have whiskers and an acute sense of smell. Even though its egg has remained almost ostrich-sized, the kiwi itself has evolved in the opposite way to most island birds and has shrunk its body size. After about 80 days, the slow process of hatching begins. Lack of oxygen stimulates the chick to crack the shell open, but the struggle to be free is exhausting. To build up its strength, it will need to rest for up to 12 hours before finally emerging from the shell. In fact, it's not quite true to say that there are no mammals at all on these islands. There are two species, and they're both bats. But in these damp and misty, predator-free forests, one species, the short-tailed bat, seems to have decided that its future lies on the ground, not in the air. Even though it originally came to the islands by wing, these strange creatures rarely use them today while feeding. They can fly, but may well be in the process of evolving towards flightlessness, like the kiwi. But of all the flightless creatures found in this ancient land, there was one that amazed the first human arrivals. A walking giant that seemed to offer them the promise of food for life, and which they called therefore moa, meaning chicken. There were 12 species of moa, and the largest was enormous, sometimes up to 3 metres high. These were the endemic megafauna of Aotearoa, the dominant herbivores, filling the same ecological niche as elephants do in Africa today. They'd been around for over 70 million years. There must have been thousands of birds like this here before humans arrived, and we know quite a lot about them. In addition to skeletons like this, we've got eggs, feathers, and even moa mummies. And the only danger these birds knew would have been from above, because they were preyed on by the world's largest eagle. It had claws like a tiger and could drop on a bird like this with the force of a concrete block. But pretty soon, danger was to come from a completely different direction, from the people that were eventually to call themselves the Maori. When the Polynesians settled in Aotearoa, they lived first of all on the coast and brought with them the knowledge of how to use fire to clear patches of land to grow crops. They brought seeds, plants and tubers from the tropics, but found that only one, the kumara or sweet potato, would survive in these cooler lands, and then only on the warmer North Island. But with such a bounty from nature, these first settlers hunted and gathered, enjoying a diet of seafood and seal meat from the coast, as well as birds, plants and fruit from the forest. The first Polynesians also brought with them a deep respect for the natural world that's still alive today. All elements of nature were seen as ancestors and kin, bound by ancient ties and rules, bringing an underlying shape and harmony to the world, called whakapapa.
Whakapapa literally translated would mean genealogy, but to Maori it's a bit more than that, because the whole ethos of Maoridom really comes from whakapapa. So we believe that we have come from Io Matua, who is the supreme being, who had a number of other gods, Rangi and Papa, the sky and the earth, and they had a number of children who became all the gods of the forest. So every Maori person likes to trace their lineage, their linkage back to a common ancestor, and I guess that's the importance of whakapapa as a human, and also the importance of whakapapa in your relationship to other people.
Deep in the forest, a ceremony that combines modern Christianity with an ancient Maori ritual. Plants and animals were thought to be relatives, with a life essentially similar to that of humans, whose existence wasn't seen as something separate from the natural world around them. To cut down a tree without first paying one's respects to Tane, the spirit of the forest, would therefore be intruding on one's own family, trampling disrespectfully on one's whakapapa. So the first chip from the tree is symbolically returned to the forest, to Tane, and buried in the soil. It's a symbol of respect and renewal, of new growth, new life. The Maori believed that the gods had granted man alone the right to take birds, fish and plants for their food and other survival needs, but only as long as the proper rituals were observed. Afterwards, the carvers are free to claim their tree, which is destined to be shaped into a ceremonial war canoe, watched over, as always, by the spirits of the forest. It was this intimacy with nature which helped the Maori to find food in the forests, especially birds. To succeed as hunters, they became the ultimate bird watchers, studying where and when different species fed and nested, and passing on that knowledge from generation to generation. But to begin with, hunting was easy, as the many species of flightless or semi-flightless birds were completely unused to predators and had no fear of man. They are especially vulnerable to extinction through overhunting, as many had evolved slow reproductive cycles, some breeding just once every 4 years. Birds that are rare today, like the semi-flightless night parrot, the kakapo, were then abundant and hunted for their decorative feathers as well as their meat. Common flightless birds like the weka or ground hen were particularly important for the Maori diet, as they provided plenty of meat in one easy catch. These, like the kiwi and others, were usually hunted with the help of dogs, which they brought with them from Polynesia. The practice is banned today in New Zealand itself, but still carried out on the nearby Chatham Islands. But as human populations increased, hunting on this scale was bound to have an impact on the flightless birds, especially the large ones like the moa. Deep in the South Island's caves are holes in the rock where the giant creatures fell and were unable to escape, eventually starving to death. But crammed though they are with bones, these moa death traps never threatened the population. It was only when man arrived on Aotearoa that extinction beckoned.
Some moa were among the largest birds that ever lived. And to judge from the size of this leg bone, their drumsticks must have been enormous. And this meat was probably here for the taking for the first people who arrived in New Zealand. That's because these birds were naive. All a hunter probably had to do was walk up to them, put a noose over their head and walk them off to the nearest ovens. And I reckon that faced with an abundance of meat like that, I would have downed the gardening tools and just settled in for a long life of feasting.
Today, the traditional communal hangi or feast involves the slaughter of a pig, cow or sheep. But in the early days of colonisation, the Polynesians would have gorged themselves on moa. The slaughter was incredibly wasteful. In some cases, only the drumsticks were taken, the rest discarded. The enormous wastage of meat, clear evidence that the moa were initially abundant and easy to hunt. And this abundance of meat supported huge settlements where people lived in peace. They were the largest to exist in New Zealand until the arrival of the Europeans. But then, suddenly, the moa were gone.
there were certain areas which were prime moa hunting areas, partly because they had high populations, partly because they had river access into the interior of New Zealand. What would happen is that Maori hunting parties would go in during the breeding season. And at that time, of course, the hunting could be funded by eating the eggs, which were the perfect travel food, you know, requiring little preparation and so on. And the torpid males, who tended to sit the eggs, would be relatively easy game. So moa populations in their peak areas are attacked at both ends, eggs and fathers. And the resulting meat is rapidly rafted down these fast-flowing rivers to a kind of meat processing base camp at the mouth of the rivers. So those key areas were creamed off pretty fast.
The Polynesian rat, or kiori, which were eaten by the Maori, had arrived with the first waka and quickly began to plunder the smaller birds and animals. With only birds of prey to fear and the hunting traps of the Maori, their numbers soon multiplied to plague proportions. The Maori say they brought the Polynesian rat with them deliberately, but I'm not so sure. For back where they came from, it was a serious agricultural pest. And when it arrived here, whether as a stowaway or livestock, it was to become a major plague in these forests. And that's because they were so long isolated that nothing like a rat had ever existed in them before. The arrival of the first rats here was to set off an ecological holocaust. In only 400 to 500 years, the bird population of Aotearoa had been decimated by the Polynesian future eaters and the rats they brought with them. And the great megafauna were extinct. With the moa gone, the Polynesians became dependent on hunting smaller birds as a major source of sustenance. In special workshops, skilled hands made traps to catch specific species. Some of these ingenious traps were self-triggering, while others, like this noose, had to be manually operated. With the other flightless birds also depleted, the most important game birds now were pigeons. In the autumn and winter, they gorge themselves on fruit and are easy to catch, using nooses dipped in a trough and baited with berries. The next most important bird for hunting purposes was the kaka, the forest parrot, which favoured the higher perches of the beech forests. They were caught using decoy birds or by single nooses pulled tight by waiting hunters. Waterfowl, like the black stilt, were stalked through the wetlands. While visiting migrants like the godwit would gather in numbers by the water's edge, where nooses and nets could be hidden to entangle their long legs and feet. Catching these flocks of visiting birds took great skill, but their numbers were substantial and they provided a great seasonal feast for the Maori. But soon, even the great numbers of migrant waterfowl and seabirds also became part of the future-eating cycle as the era of food abundance on Aotearoa started to come to an end. For the Maori were still hunter-gatherers and consumed the supply of meat from birds faster than species like the gannet could regenerate. Despite their understanding of the need to conserve species, the Polynesian settlers steadily depleted the supply of birds as human numbers expanded on the high-protein diet. The Maori were as yet unable to convert their intimate knowledge of nature into principles that would help them to conserve their precious environmental resources. It seems to me that there's a fundamental contradiction here. For the Maori had a deep respect for plants and animals, and yet they hunted the moa and other megafauna to extinction, turning this from a land of plenty into a land of hunger. Well, I think that happened because then the Maori were newcomers and they didn't fully understand the vulnerability of life here. And it takes a long time to build the knowledge you need to manage resources effectively. Well, all the while, their population was building until finally their food resources were almost exhausted. And it was only then that they realised the full impact of their future eating habits. Without effective communal efforts at conservation, even the coastal protein resources were running out. This was the next stage of the future eating cycle, eliminating food resources in order of what's easiest to hunt or gather and what's most nutritious. A fur seal cow gives birth to a pup. Within minutes, the pup springs into life and is ready to take to the waters, though its mother has other ideas. Seals, sea lions and penguins were once abundant all around the coasts, but as population pressure grew, they too all but disappeared from the more populous North Island. Seal breeding colonies are now only found on remoter parts of the South Island, and it's here that the last of the yellow-eyed penguin colonies have also survived. The yellow-eyed penguin breeds only in New Zealand and is one of 30 species once found here in what was probably a global centre for penguin evolution. Unusually, they often prefer to nest away from the shore, and every evening they can be seen crossing the beaches and making the long trek back up the hill slopes to the sheltering forest beyond. They nest in burrows and among the roots and caves of the tree-lined cliffs. But as the coastal forests were gradually cleared by the Maori for farms, the nest sites began to disappear. Predation from dogs and the Maori themselves accelerated the decline of the species, and today it has the dubious distinction of being the rarest penguin in the world. For the Polynesian voyagers, the cycle of future eating that had followed them around the Pacific had caught up with them again, even in this land of plenty. Perhaps they were deluded by the abundance of wildlife on Aotearoa, with its millions of birds and huge numbers of easily hunted sea mammals lazing on its shores. Whatever the reason, it appears that these expert hunters underestimated their impact on the naive, vulnerable species of Aotearoa and were unprepared for the food shortages that were to follow. But the evidence from Maori rubbish dumps is clear. The diet of sea mammals and seafood got smaller and smaller over time as these coastal resources themselves were run down. With the moa gone, other birds and seal breeding colonies seriously depleted, the Maori needed to find other ways to feed themselves if they were to survive at all in the land of the long white cloud. As hunger began to stalk the land, the Maori had no choice but to expand their farming. To open up the land to farms and bracken, whose root was eaten as a staple crop, 40% of New Zealand's native forests were burnt. In the North Island, sweet potato horticulture was developed, even though the cool climate made this difficult. Elsewhere, the Maori were forced to rely on bracken root, and protein deficiency and undernourishment became widespread. Meanwhile, hunters moved further and further inland in search of elusive bird protein, often returning empty-handed. For many, this was a time of hardship and hunger, but it forced the Maori to organise in order to survive and triggered a period of rapid cultural change and turmoil. By the beginning of the 16th century, the Maori had begun to build great fortresses called pa right across Aotearoa. This one here on One Tree Hill in the middle of Auckland is enormous. Here people have sculpted a whole mountainside into a fort, and there must have been thousands of warriors living on this site. Great fortresses like this suggest to me that Maori people had actually entered the next stage of future eating, and that meant war, a war over resources. The famous haka war dance became increasingly important at this time. This one is saying, "We will stand our ground." The actual frequency of full-scale war was probably low, as this was a luxury rarely afforded in a resource-depleted land. This was the beginning of the so-called classical period of Maori history, a time of fortress building, conflict, and even sometimes cannibalism. The hundreds of pa across the land were not only symbols of status and power, but they also had the more practical function of being fortified food stores.
Once, by whatever series of accidents, one group developed pa from peaceful villages or kainga and the associated food storage pits, then they'd have a military advantage over other groups. They could raid and not be counter-raided. So therefore, an arms race or a pa race suddenly begins, whereby all groups have to develop pa to protect themselves from those who have them. In addition to that, as with many other changes in Māori society, there's this rivalry for mana amongst Māori groups, which means that, you know, if you're a chief and your neighbour's got a pa, then you'll have no followers. So even within groups who never fought each other, the fact that one had a pa and another related group didn't was a stimulus to build. So you have spasms of pa building moving through the country at quite rapid rates.
I wonder what it would have been like to be a Maori in the 16th century, when there was far too many people and not enough food. But the whole thing about future eating is that it's a cycle. And by the beginning of the 16th century, I think the Maori had really hit rock bottom. And I suppose that's when you start reflecting on where you are and the nature of the land you're in, and you start adapting to it. And I think from then on, we see in Maori society the first glimmerings of conservation, of conserving their resources for the future. And from then on, that was to play an increasingly important role in the new societies that they were beginning to invent.
Hutia te rito te harakeke. Ke hiara koe te ko mako e ko. E whakatairangi tia, rere ki uta, rere ki tai. Ki mai koe kiau he hara te mea nui. Maku e ki atu, He tangata, he tangata, he tangata.
The tattoo was a mark of identity, adulthood, and above all, status, increasingly important in the new tribal groupings that began to develop. It was the ultimate adornment, the external expression of the spirituality within. Personal spirituality was also expressed collectively in art forms of all kinds, but notably the wood carving of the marae, the great communal meeting houses. Society became more hierarchical and organised as communities were forced to face up to their worsening resource crisis, triggered by the end of the great birds, the moa.
The Maori do not believe that they caused the extinction of the Moa, but I also believe that the extinction of the Moa certainly was a huge shock for all Maoridom, because that was the one bird that could provide a feed for the whole tribe. And I think the development of a lot of the Maori conservation ethic had developed then. The ethos of conservation had developed after the demise of the Moa.
Conservation for the Maori involves strengthening the traditional rules that govern the harvesting of nature's resources and enforcing them on a community-wide basis. Today's fishermen have to obey government laws that restrict where and when they can fish and which size fish they have to throw back. So it was with the Maori of the 16th century, who had to obey the spiritual restrictions laid down by the local expert on nature, the Tahunga. They knew to avoid breeding grounds and creatures that were spawning. These reefs are among the most productive in the world, home to a complex chain of life, the waters around them rich with fish and microorganisms. A crayfish unleashes her spawn on the tide, as many as 1 million at one time. As they grow, they feed on microorganisms and themselves become prey for larger creatures, only a few surviving to adulthood. All over the seabed, new life is being born, recharging the chain of creation that keeps these seas alive and productive. A stingray prepares for takeoff. Its wing-like flaps lifted through the deep in search of shellfish and crabs, one of the great sights of this underwater world. The early Maori believed that it was the special role of fish to be caught and put to use, the very reason for their existence. According to myth, Aotearoa itself had been a fish, brought up from the depths by the god Maori and turned into a homeland for human beings. Edible species were respected, therefore, as spiritual entities, and elaborate systems were developed for their management. The groper, for example, could only be caught during a short season around sunken rocks, deep out at sea. These fishing grounds were very much prized and tapu, which means sacred, under restriction. on the other hand, were regarded as warrior species and were hunted with caution. Here, a marlin has trapped a school of mackerel which have formed a large defensive wall that the predator finds difficult to penetrate. So the marlin is cleverly working the ball upwards towards the surface, knowing that there the ball will break and the fish scatter, providing a bounty for all. Whales were particularly sacred and symbolised plenty, having come from the bountiful paradise homeland of Hawaii. This is still one of the great places in the world to see whales, with several species coming here to feed, including the humpback, pilot, orca, right and sperm whales. Ambassadors from their homeland, as well as revered and distant kin, whales were at the pinnacle of a developing culture of conservation, bound up in spiritually enforced concepts like tapu and rahui.
Rahui was a sort of a temporary or sometimes permanent reservation status, I suppose would be the modern terminology, that sets aside certain areas to protect a species or to allow the numbers to build up. So I know on our particular area there was a place where there's a rahui kiwi and no one was allowed to hunt kiwi in that particular area, that particular valley, because it was kiwi grew well in it, there was all the bugs there, the right food for them, and they could breed well. But any kiwi that were kicked out, the young ones that ventured out of that area, the rahui area, they could be freely hunted. So basically a rahui was a temporary restriction on certain areas, you know, whether it was eels, pigeons, rats, kiwis, whatever.
One contemporary example of rahui concerns the harvesting on Snares Island of sooty shearwaters or mutton birds. Cooked and preserved in their own fat, mutton birds were often kept as high-protein food reserves for when other sources of protein became scarce. Strict tribal rules govern the resource. Only an agreed number of young chicks are taken during the season, the only time that the rahui is temporarily lifted. This controlled harvest leaves the adults free to breed again the next season, ensuring the sustainability of the resource. A management system first developed in response to the food crisis of the 16th century.
There's an increased use of tapu, rahui, sacred prescriptions to prevent the taking of vulnerable resources outside the appropriate times. And there's a broadening in the net that your Maori hunter-gatherer applies to nature. So a lot more foods are processed carefully and eaten. There are many kinds of berries that take days to process. There's a lot more smaller birds become targets. Mussels, for example, freshwater mussels, there's some traditional evidence that early in prehistory they're considered a contemptible food. In late prehistory, they're considered a very valuable food. So you can see the shift from a few big, easy targets to many small, difficult targets. and from extractive economics to sustainable economics.
The Maori had, it seemed, for the first time, confronted the resource crisis they'd created and moved forward into the final phase of the future eating cycle. They'd become warlike sweet potato farmers, living in large compounds with hierarchical structures and strict rules for enforcing the conservation of nature. These systems were built on two foundations: the spiritual oneness with nature and traditional knowledge that had been handed down for generations. That knowledge can still be found today in the Maori heartlands. Eel fishing is a family business bound by ancient rahui systems and access rights that have been passed from father to son. Likewise, many still have the skills to farm and manage the forests. This Maori woman is gathering the natural dyes she'll need for weaving flax, using the bark from carefully conserved trees. Plants from the forest are used by the Maori in many different ways, including paints, foods and medicines. If you scratch the surface of the modern way of life, it's still possible to find the ethos of conservation.
Welcome.
Many communities still have tahunga, for example, elders who manage the forest resources.
And you are?
Tim.
Tim.
Yeah. Even today, the lessons learned in the times of hardship survive. And who knows how successful the Maori might have been as managers of nature if their efforts hadn't been suddenly forestalled. Right through their travels across the Pacific, the Polynesian voyagers had been driven by a cycle of future eating, over-exploiting nature's resources and then moving on to colonise a new virginal island home. But here in New Zealand it was different. This was really the end of the line. There were no new islands to colonise from here. And here, the resource crisis was extreme. The Maori were just beginning to develop ways of conserving nature when suddenly, 200 years ago, the future of Aotearoa was taken out of their hands alone, for a new wave of invaders had appeared on the horizon. Soon, knowledge of this great green fertile land of mountains and forests, with whales, timber and enormous farming potential, would find its way back to another seafaring nation on the other side of the world. And then another period of colonisation would begin, the third and most damaging wave of invaders. The Maori could only watch helplessly as the future eating cycle began all over again.
E ngā tini mate ngā tini ai tua, here koutou, here koutou, here koutou. Here hoki atu ki Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao. Here hoki atu ki te kāinga tūturu mō tātou te tangata. Takota moi, moi mai, mō koutou te taiata, mātou te taiaiahi.
Stay with us for a look at the future eaters next week. Tomorrow night, Mark Davies reports from Papua New Guinea with stories from the survivors of the devastating tidal wave that shocked the world. Four Corners tomorrow night at 8:30.